Okay, we're going to get started in just a moment. Thanks everyone for joining us. That's coming onto the webinar. Feel free to let us know where you're watching from in the chat box, or if you have any questions, feel free to let us know in the Q&A. We're going to be recording this, so you'll be able to view this later as well. Great. And this webinar is the third in a series that's been going on for the past couple weeks. So grateful to Diane and Allison for joining us today. And while more people join the webinar, just a couple reminders. Like I said, we're going to be recording this. You can access the recording with the same registration link that you used prior. We'll be sharing a survey at the end. So if you're interested in a certificate of attendance, we encourage you to fill that out. And we'll be sharing some resources and links. Both Diane and Allison will be sharing some, and we have some resources from NCEA that we'll be sharing as well. Great. I think we're about ready to start. So with that, I'll pass it off to Dr. Floyd to lead us off with prayer. So thank you both for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thanks for getting things started for us. We'd like to begin our session today, as we do in all things, in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, continue to bless our Catholic schools and their good work. Help them to be a source of wisdom, love, and peace. May all who enter our classrooms be filled with the wisdom of the Holy Spirit. May Catholic education grow so your good news can be taught to children and students around the world. In your name we pray. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Diane. I want to welcome everyone to our session together this afternoon. As John mentioned, this is the third of a three-part series focused on ways that we can design systems, collect data, as well as use that data to provide educators across our diocese with more personalized professional learning, so that not only are we supporting growth of our students, but we're supporting growth of our educators as well. Diane and I want to ensure that at the end of this session, you receive a copy of the slide deck, as well as some of the tools that we are going to share throughout the course of the session. So if you are interested in those materials, you can text NCEA 2021-PL for professional learning to the number that's here on the screen. And I'm also going to put this information for you in the chat box so that you have access to that. But we want to make sure that throughout the course of the session here, you are able to focus so that you're not distracted looking through a bunch of different materials, but are able to really center on the work, take some notes, and think about what are the possible applications for this in your own school or your own diocese. So Diane and I want to take just a minute to introduce ourselves and tell you a little bit about our work, and then we'll go ahead and dive right in. Diane?
Thanks so much, Allie. As everyone has shared at this point, I'm Dr. Diane Floyd. I'm happy to serve as the superintendent of schools for the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. I've had the fortunate opportunity to serve in that capacity for the past 5 years, actually 9 years at the district or systems level in our Catholic schools office. I had previously served as an associate superintendent. Prior to that, I'd been in our system for 10 years as a principal, and then 6 years in the classroom in the special education classroom as a teacher. And as we all know, the list of job responsibilities for a superintendent can often be quite long and extensive. But when I think about those areas of focus that I truly love being able to do with our school leaders is in those areas of that strategic planning, looking for the what helps their advance their schools in those areas of growth, as well as those areas of curricular refinement and helping to work for improving instruction for our students, and then school collaboration as well. I really always find much joy in those opportunities where we're able to connect with our school leaders, not only together as a whole group, but of course, connecting them in smaller formats as well too. I'll let Allie take a minute to introduce herself as well.
Thank you so much, Diane. My name is Allie Rodman. I am the founder of The Learning Loop, and I am a full-time professional learning designer and facilitator. So as a former teacher and former school leader and current school board member, I work with schools and districts internationally to think about the ways in which we can refine our adult learning. So we spend a lot of time thinking about student learning in our spaces, but my leadership and thought partnership is really around what are the andragogical or those adult learning practices that we can continue to refine and personalize so that the limited time that we have with our teachers and with our leaders is as personalized and as purposeful as possible. And with that, particularly now more than ever, comes an attention to adult wellness. So you'll see some of that threaded throughout the work that we're going to share here today as well. So in this coaching, some of the work that we think about is how do we begin and continue with student data? So we certainly want to be looking at the observation data that we are collecting throughout the school year to guide some of the professional learning that we are planning and designing. But we also want to ensure that we're leveraging the student data that we're collecting as well to make sure that we're bringing those different data points together in a way that's purposeful and that's also aligned. So the way in which we did that together in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City was to first engage in some diocesan-wide benchmark data analysis. And to guide that process, we used a common cycle or common steps for looking at data, so that when all principals and assistant principals, and then hopefully their teacher teams were looking at data, we were looking at it through the same steps and with the same action planning tools, so that we began to collaborate using a common language together. And in that work, we not only provided guidance to principals and assistant principals in how to engage in some of that analysis, but we also provided some guidance around what it might look like to establish teacher teams and to equip them with protocols to guide some of those conversations as well. And with that, we wanted to ensure that we were modeling the way. So in our workshops with school leaders, we would walk them through the cycle, the steps, and the tools step by step. And when appropriate or when requested, we would also go on site to work directly with teacher teams to provide a model of what some of that analysis might look like from one benchmark administration to the next, to ensure that they were not only looking at the data in thoughtful ways, but action planning to see real change in the classroom. But what that meant was that we needed to open up some of the reports a little bit, and we had to operate with a sense of trust and transparency. So when we would gather leaders together, we wanted to provide an opportunity for them to not only look at their own school data, but also to look across the Archdiocese so that they were able to see some trends by grade level and by content area, because we felt it was our responsibility as professional learning facilitators and as diocesan leaders to be able to provide that space for comparison, for context, and for reflection. We knew that many of the leaders were operating day to day in their individual buildings in isolation. And unless we were providing that space for collaborative action planning, it may not happen organically on their own. So when we brought these groups together, we tried to be cognizant and not only of the tools that we were providing, but also the ways in which these individuals were grouped. So one of the things that we learned early on in this collaboration is that it was quite helpful to think about school size when pairing groups together, so that small schools might have a similar context, but a very different context than a larger school. And we took it upon ourselves not just to have the discussion across the Archdiocese, but to also have some of those smaller group discussions that allowed leaders to really dig deep. So with that, we provided a variety of different data reports at the Archdiocese level. We also reached out to leaders who might be willing to share more publicly their individual school data that we could use as a model and a point of comparison to guide some of those analyses processes. And throughout this, as we continued to dig into student data, not just at a school level, but an archdiocesan level, we recognized that there were some needs for systemic supports. And there were some system-wide trends that we were beginning to see. So in listening to conversations that leaders were having, in working shoulder to shoulder with them through some of this analysis, One of the things that we found was a skill gap in their own ability to design highly effective assessments. So we began to take note of some of these different trends and offer leader level professional learning that could be turnkeyed, hopefully then at the school level. And through this, we started to identify and address some of the leader capacity gaps when it came to analyzing data and engaging in observations, but also admittedly, some of their skill gaps that we felt as leaders, we needed to take responsibility to help fill for them so that they could be more effective at the individual school level for their own teachers. So Diane's going to talk a little bit more about some of the different ways that we went about building leader capacity beyond just analyzing student data together.
Great, thank you, Allie. So as Allie had shared with you, some things started to really kind of come to life as we were doing some of this work together. And our conversation today really kind of brings home and pulls together what we had found was really a threefold goal for us in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, which was focusing on on the positive, building on the strengths and affirming the uniqueness of all of our staff members, staying true to our Catholic identity. But we knew we needed an effective tool that would help us collect this data, which we really focused on in our second session that we offered. And so what this did is it really gave us that metric to identify those system-wide strengths and the growth opportunities that existed, and really allowed us to start to strategically respond not only to teacher development needs, improving student academic growth and achievement, but as Allie just shared, it really helped us to shed some light on what kind of capacity we still needed to grow within our own school leaders. As many of you know, if you serve in that capacity already, you can get pulled multiple different directions in the course of the day, and quickly find that some things like being the instructional leader, sometimes even being the spiritual leader, can quickly get put on the back burner because we're doing so much in the managing and operational type area. So what we first found was, what kind of content, what are we talking about here? What's the real need as far as for our leaders and the pedagogical knowledge gaps that existed there? We all came from a variety of backgrounds, and our areas of strengths, vary as we come into those leadership roles. And so that initial work that we were doing together was very content driven, and it was helping to meet the needs and address the gaps that existed for those school leaders. Some we found needed help just simply leading their teachers in that more robust design of assessments, as Allie shared. We saw that really quickly. It wasn't just a matter of helping to define formative and summative assessments, but then how do we help them, help their teachers to craft something that really is giving them the feedback they need to assess, students' level of understanding. Others needed help to how to simply tackle data analysis. We went into those conversations thinking that they would all just kind of know what to do, but some of them needed to know how do I start to build a site level data team? What does that look like? Who would I engage in that process? For some of them, it was simply they had that, but they didn't really have the tools that they needed to tackle that data analysis. So what would they even need to have in front of them to help them to start to do the analysis piece of this? And then from there, how might they take those results and start to translate those actually into actionable plans, and not just become something that was like, oh, this is nice to know and we see this, but now what do we actually do with that? And still others really needed help just leading their teachers to know how to effectively engage their students on their own growth process. How could they engage students in that conversation about where they were at and where they needed to be and how they could get there? So often teachers were just kind of, making some assumptions on their own, or looking at the data and making decisions, but never really engaging the students in that process. And so still missing the mark of that target just a little bit. And so helping them to aim a little closer to that bullseye. So as we moved into that idea of professional learning for our school leaders, it first happened really through that whole group professional learning opportunity with all of our principals together. Often this was coming in the form of a monthly principal meeting, and really trying to just share all of this information, all of this content with them. So we started first really working with feedback forms that we had, and the type of data that we were trying to collect when we were doing our performance review process with the teachers. Some of that we were actually finding information directly from the classroom observations we were doing, or other artifacts that we might have from conferencing with teachers. We were actually able to use with the principals videos from YouTube or the teaching channel, some own recorded personal local videos that we've done in our own classrooms for those teachers that were willing, so that way they could start to simulate and do those activities together. So as we were starting to walk through those frameworks more frequently together, we started to find that there were some differing thoughts about the performance indicators. What would this look like? What it looked like to one principal looked a little differently to another. And so we would talk through those things together with questions and answers. As I shared, we would do some of those norming observations together with videos, just to be able to talk through through the lens of what one might see and how that might either reinforce from other colleagues or vary greatly. And then we actually did some mock debriefs. We actually sat down together and talked about, how do I give that specific feedback to a teacher, and what does that conversation look like, especially when it may be have to be a little bit more of a challenging conversation, wanting to open with something that was positive and affirming for a teacher, and trying to close with that as well, and sandwiching that when there was concerns that were coming up, and how to really drill down to being able to help a teacher to understand. And so as we were doing that and doing those processes, even more started to emerge. And as we moved into the second year of our process with the teacher performance review work we were doing, we shifted again how we approach the professional learning and building capacity for our school leaders. And this led to the adoption of principal cohorts. We found that giving the principals a chance to work in smaller groups, as Ali shared, we kind of looked at like-sized schools, or we looked to maybe a rural versus suburban settings, just relying on the geography as far as to help group them and start to meet their needs a little bit better. Through that, we asked for principal leaders out of that. We had 5 of our principals that we had come forward willing to serve as a leader of these cohorts. And we offered additional capacity building for them. And that meant we would do some professional learning with them. Ali came in to help us in that process, to actually model what they would then be doing with their cohorts. It gave them a chance to really dive into the framework that we had for the performance review process, looking at examples of that. And then they themselves did some live observations together, where we could come back then together and do some immediate processing on those. And then really start to do, offer feedback to one another. We were asking these cohort leaders not only to meet together to really deepen the understanding of those teacher performance indicators, and then engage in conversations about the observations they were doing, but then to really start to think about, now, how does this translate to helping our colleagues in doing this as well too. By doing this together, we were able to provide context and examples for those teacher performance indicators that the team was able to look at together in those norming activities, and really allowed us to be able to take that back again to their fellow principal colleagues to be able to guide them through that process as well. And then ultimately sharing those, we were asking them to start to do some work with sharing that back together. And so just to give you an example, this Ali is sharing with you the performance level descriptors for one of our areas. And so this actually is domain 2, classroom environment. And you can see a couple of the subdomain areas within there on the slide. And one of the things we started to determine was that just the slight difference in the verbiage that would move a teacher from one performance level to another. Principals were having some struggles with distinguishing between that, helping them even to know how to have the conversation with their teachers about what might move a teacher from the applying level into innovating. And you can see there's some key words highlighted there that just by not only their learning space expressing the Catholic faith and classroom culture, reflecting those shared faith values, but then amplifying that, not only expressing, but now amplifying it. And what could that look like? And really letting those cohort leaders process that together, because it helped them respond so much better, as well as us from our Catholic school office perspective, to guide the other principals in this process as well too. And you can see often just that distinguishing piece from being the teacher, being the sole manager of all of that at the applying level. What took things to the innovating level was when they were able to actively engage students in that process. And so we started to talk about, so what can be the things that we help a teacher with to help them move in that direction. So just to give you an idea of really how they talked through those things together before taking it back out to their colleagues. So then as we continue to empower our cohort leaders, we were meeting with them 2 times a year. And then they themselves then went out to meet with their own cohort that they were leading. And at that particular time, we were able to create for them basically sample agendas of what a meeting might look like when they gathered together. We were asking them to gather at least a minimum of 2 times. In place of doing a traditional monthly principals meeting, we allowed them the opportunity then within a given month to meet with their cohort. And we utilized observer guides for this. That actually, I think, is where we really found the need for those, emerged through those first times that the cohorts met. And what that gave in responding to the feedback we had from the principals were that it created this list basically of look-fors that they were actually able to help identify as they were going into the classroom, made their observation more focused instead of just being a recounting of what the teacher's movements were in the classroom. It gave them some examples of the things that they might want to be able to not only look for, but offer as feedback to the teachers. It gave them some resources to be able to use themselves or share with teachers. And then ultimately it gave them some sentence starters as they were writing that high quality feedback as part of the performance review process. We really wanted to make as much of it as remove any barrier that we could for a principal. And so knowing that if just knowing how to start the sentence, start the conversation was the hard part for a principal, especially when it needed to be kind of courageous and compassionate for a teacher that might be challenged in an area or struggling in an area, then we wanted to have some natural places for that to start. And so that's where those sentence starters came in to offer that focused feedback. All the resources that we were able to provide through these observer guides actually came directly from the Charlotte Danielson framework. It was the framework that we modeled our performance review process after with some tweaks. And so the wonderful thing about that is that we were able to go back to that framework time and time again, not only through our collaboration with Allie and in her work with us, but then also through those resource guides as well too. And then finally, as they went forth and were spending that time together, they were able to actually start to really refine those peer-to-peer observation practices that they were actually having that they had together. What we were asking in this model is that the principals would meet with their cohort groups, and they would have a structure for that day. Optimally, we were wanting them to be at different school sites for that. This year looked a little different, knowing that we were navigating not having a lot of extra visitors in the building. So they were able to do some things more in a virtual capacity. But we wanted those principals to be able to have the full day together. So that way the cohort could go into classrooms and be able to complete observations together and then come back and process together as well too. We also gave them the caveat that if principals wanted to be able to use those, to kind of help take care of some of those classroom observations that they would be doing anyways, that these could count towards that specific purpose as well too. If they felt comfortable with that, that was completely, their option to be able to use these written observations by their cohort if they chose to do that, but really wanted to make it attractive, I guess you could say, for someone to offer up, for them, for their colleagues to be in the building with them for that day. But then in addition, what we wanted that outcome of that day to be, other than the work the cohort was doing together, was that they would complete a learning log. And so that was the other ask that we had of our cohort leaders, is that they would basically synthesize the work that had been done by their cohort in that day together, that just kind of presented that follow-up to us from their meeting together. And what that gave us a chance to do was then respond and tweak what we were doing from our level at the diocesan level and the opportunities we were providing for them. If suddenly there were those aha moments and they were felt there was no longer a need to have to norm together in a particular domain area, then we feel really comfortable in this classroom environment area, but still struggle a little bit about the assessment and what that actually should look like in action when we're in the classroom. Then we could really tailor the work we were doing together collectively back as a whole group at principal meetings or other professional learning offerings, maybe in similar smaller group settings, that we could partner them together. We were able to see what their key questions were that they were raising, what the key takeaways were from their time together, as well as what actual observations were they completing together, and starting to really ascertain where they were feeling confident and in those areas of need that still existed to them. And so when they would submit those to back to us, not only through our Catholic school office, through our leadership team, but then also in conjunction with Allie, we were able to sit down, process those together, and plan for that next cohort leader training session that would be coming up, and prepare them for that next round of time to have together. So once again, always trying to solicit feedback from them and then take action based on it where we could. Some things were just going to maybe, there wasn't enough of a consensus around it. And so we were able then to talk maybe one-on-one with school leaders about that, or help where needed, but always coming back to being reflective in practice and then using that to strategize for what that next need might be. Allie's going to keep us going at this point and start to help to identify what some of those observation trends and learning needs were that we started to emerge.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. So I want to pause here for just a minute and take any questions that you all may have. So we've talked through some of the ways that we kind of began with and continued with utilizing student data to identify some of those needs for students, as well as for teachers and leaders who support them. And then Diane has kind of talked through some of the ways that we went about better drilling down to identify what those leader needs are, and then in turn responding to that from both a professional learning as well as a capacity building perspective as it relates to content as well as skill. So I would love to hear if there's any questions that you all have with some of the processes and the practices that we've shared up until this point. Go ahead and put them in the chat box for us. And we'll also save a little bit of time for questions at the end, but I want to make sure that we're not missing anything along the way. Yeah, so the question is, when you ask schools to share data, were you talking about observation data or achievement data? And the answer is both. So across the Archdiocese, we have engaged in different layers of data analysis processes together as a full cohort of principals and assistant principals. So the first layer of that data analysis process has been ACT Aspire data. That was kind of the first piece, right? So that was student data, and we shared what that archdiocesan trend looked like, as well as gave each school an opportunity to review and, should they choose, share their school level data. Initially, that was just ACT Aspire. The K-8 schools have since transitioned to also administer the NWEA MAP assessment multiple points throughout the year. So schools have been quite open about sharing that data with each other as well, and using that as a point of both reflection as well as collaborative action planning. And then the second piece of data, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute, was sharing the observation data trends that we were seeing across the Archdiocese. So, were there particular grade levels that were perhaps performing at a higher level in certain performance indicators than others? Were we seeing trends from new teachers versus more experienced teachers? Were we seeing common areas where we might need to provide more professional learning across the Archdiocese? So we've been quite thoughtful about looking at data from a variety of different perspectives, both for our student learners as well as our adults. Great question.
Good question.
All right, so feel free to keep the questions coming, or if there's just points of clarification that would be helpful for us to make as we go, certainly raise them for us so that we can share as much as we possibly can during our time here together. So the final piece of this that Diane and I wanted to share with you all are, what were some of the observation trends that we saw, and then subsequently, what were the learning needs that emerged where we found different gaps, both skill gaps as well as, quite honestly, some mindset gaps that we needed to fill for our leaders and teachers in order to improve student achievement overall. So we wanted first to look at continued growth. And with this came an analysis of the observation data that we were collecting from schools. So we were quite transparent, quite honestly, about sharing with schools what the observation completion rates were by quarter and paying attention to some of those trends. So as I'm sure you can imagine, we were completing, or I should say principals were completing much higher rates of observations at the beginning of the year than they might at some of the busier points, right? And we needed to take this into account, both in our model as well as in the ways that we supported them. So we would pay attention to that, and we would also very openly share it, so that if one leader was doing particularly well about, kind of curbing some of the administrative tasks and being that instructional leader who was able to commit to getting into classrooms, we were able to partner them with someone who might be struggling a little bit, who, might be taking, lots and lots of parent meetings, but not making the time as much to be able to get into classrooms the way that they would like to. What does that mean to schedule that and block that on your calendar and make it a priority? We also started looking for system-wide or archdiocesan-wide trends. So what were some of the strengths and what were some of the growth opportunities? And Diane shared some of these. So things such as assessment design or frequency of student feedback started to emerge as areas of need that we not only wanted to fill with our leaders, but then also encourage them in their professional learning plans at the school level to ensure that they were filling those gaps for their teachers as well. We would look at some of the trends by grade band. So were there particular performance indicators where a K-3 grade band might be outperforming a 9-10 or an 11-12 grade band, and vice versa? And why do we think that might be happening? And it opened up some really rich discussions among principals who might not always get the opportunity to collaborate together day to day to think about some of the ways that they might be supporting or amplifying those practices at their building level, and how they might share some of those strategies and approaches with one another, so that if there was a building or a grade band or a site that was struggling with a particular practice or a particular area of competence, we were able to peer-to-peer deepen one another's skill set and toolbox, if you will, so that leaders felt as though they had the capacity to lead some of that instructional improvement locally, and that they felt like, they had the strategies and the tools that they needed to be able to facilitate those conversations and move teacher practice forward. And then finally, one of the areas that we identified that was quite honestly a real area of need was the quality of written feedback that some of the principals were providing to teachers. So we found that while we had done those initial sort of mock debriefs that we described, right? We had kind of set up, a sample classroom. We had practiced walking through the frameworks and distinguishing between the different performance levels together. We had normed some of our, for lack of a better word, scoring of particular indicators. And we had practiced together what those debriefs might look like and sound like with the teacher. One of the areas where we fell short initially in the professional learning that we provided was that we weren't first modeling, but then also providing feedback on the quality of written feedback that principals were giving to teachers. So as we saw some of the observation forums begin to come in, or as we engaged with our cohort leaders in those groups and began to think about and see what that looked like, we recognized that that was a gap we needed to fill. So if you'll recall in the observer guide that Diane shared a few slides ago and that you'll get a sample of with the resources for this session, that final column focused on sentence starters because we wanted to model for leaders what high quality feedback in each of those areas looked like and sounded like. And we also needed to start paying attention to where there were points of misalignment in a performance level that was being selected and the type of feedback that was being given. So for example, in some of the work with our cohort leaders, we found that they might be, identifying a particular element as applying, kind of that middle level of performance. Yet all of the written feedback they were providing was exclusively framed from a positive perspective. That's not to say that we wanted that to be, mostly critical, but if we're putting someone in that middle category, we had a responsibility as observers and as leaders to outline what those next steps were going to be, what was going to move that teacher from an applying level to an innovating level. And that was certainly a gap that we found we needed to fill as we went through this work together. So here's a sample of, what one of these data reports looks like. This was across the Archdiocese. So you would see the number of teachers who were developing, applying, or innovating in this particular performance indicator. This is related to classroom environment. This one in particular was around building a safe space for prayer and reflection. So you can see kind of, what percentage of teachers fell in what place from pre-K through 12. But then it's also interesting to see this same data set broken out across grade bands. So here we're able to see for each of the grade bands, how many teachers were developing, how many were applying, how many were innovating, and how many were we're not seeing evidence, right? So here we're seeing, wow, we've got a few more teachers in that 9, 10, and 11, 12 grade band who might not have had evidence of a space for prayer or reflection in their classroom. And that could be for a variety of different reasons, right? It might be that teachers are sharing spaces or moving from classroom to classroom throughout the day. But if nothing else, it gave us a point of conversation to begin looking at why are these things happening? And collectively, as an archdiocese, how can we as a group of leaders continue to move teacher practice forward in a more positive way on behalf of our students? And what does excellence in our learning spaces really look like? So this gave us that neutral data point to be able to facilitate, quite honestly, what could have been, and in some cases were, some really tough but crucial conversations with leaders about their responsibility as the instructional leader in their building. So with that in mind, we were able to identify some opportunities, if you will, for continued growth. So using this data, we began to work with schools who chose to do so to establish some late arrival and early dismissal models. And Diane's going to talk about a little bit more about what that PLER model looked like and share with you some of the other functions here as well.
There. Thanks, Allie. So yes, as we started to identify where those needs were, as we know in most situations, it's where do we find the time and how do we do this? So it's one thing to know, but now how do we actually, how do we take the action on this? And so one of the first things we did as far as for the continued growth was we provided a model known as the Professional Learning Early Release Program. PLER is what it stood for. And what we allowed schools to do was if they wanted to do this, we know sometimes trying to always meet after school and outside of the school day, teachers often are, the ability to focus on professional learning can be challenging for them at times. And there's not a lot of capacity sometimes, first in the morning prior to the start of the school day. And then weekends just seem to really kind of be off the table, for most reasons. But we really were trying to figure out how do we build capacity, but still stay, with fidelity to what our instructional time and the length of our school days and all those things needed to be. And so we provided this model for schools if they were interested in planning for it, that they could, we set some parameters to be able to do either a late start day or an early release day once a week. And what they had to do was, first of all, use an approved progress monitoring tool. This was prior to, as Ali shared, we started using the NWEA MAPS testing. And so not all schools had adopted that at that point. And so we asked them, you need to at least be doing something then to monitor progress of students. We also asked them to submit a schedule as well too, of what their semester would look like with these PLER sessions, and how they would build that into their either late start or early dismissal. We wanted also to make sure that there are allotted instructional minutes that they needed to be fulfilling for their different content areas. They would still be able to meet those, and how they were shifting things to be able to allow to do that. And then we asked for just like a rough sketch initially what the schedule of those meetings might look like. And so we kind of gave them a recipe, for lack of a better word, that said that at least 50% of those would be just a peer review of class assessments, sitting down, teacher to teacher, and letting them look at those assessments together, and being able to process about what was working, what wasn't working, what was truly, checks for understanding versus something that really wasn't giving them any feedback at all, on the part of the student progress. We asked that there'd be 25% of those meetings be around new professional learning, knowing that there would be some things that would come along the way, maybe something from the diocese, maybe something that just is an interest area for the school, but they could be able to have 25% dedicated to that. And then 25% needed to be around that data analysis piece, taking those progress monitoring tools that they had, as well as the summative standardized testing that we were doing for us, and over this time that's been the ACT Aspire, and that 25% of those meetings would be dedicated to those to that task and function. And what that would allow them to do then was, through the approval through our office and coordination with that, was that they could then be able to use that time in their day. And many of them built this in, so it'd be once a week. Following a similar model that our high schools had already been using for professional learning. And so this was really trying to help build that capacity for those elementary school principals who we know just many times it's them, and their day is so taxed with being able to provide leadership effectively in the areas that they need to. And so this afforded them the ability to do that. We had 4 of our schools that accepted that offer and did that over the course of the 1920 school year. This year's looked a little different. They the ability to be able to dedicate as much time to that. One school did it in full fidelity, like they continued with that same PLER model they had proposed in the initial year, but the other 3 kind of did modified versions of it, mainly because they didn't want to, they wanted to maximize the instructional time that they had in the course of their school day. But what this afforded us, once again, was trying to be creative with our scheduling and give teachers time together for those collegial conversations that they need to be able to have, but oftentimes we're not able to carve out the time in their day to do. Even with shared planning times, it just wasn't long enough to get into the work that they needed to do. We often, as we shared earlier, we were able to pair schools together with some schedule coordination during diocesan-wide professional learning days. We might have 2 to 3 sites that, because they were tackling a particular topic together or wanted to focus in a certain area, that they were able then to come together and coordinate their time together. And we also looked for ways that we could start to pool our professional learning resources. We've been doing that to some extent already through our the equitable services and the federal funding that was provided to us specifically for those. in the Oklahoma City metro area, just because proximity allowed them and that the ability to be able to do more together. And then we had those that were bounded by Oklahoma City Public Schools. That was the funding we had access to. And so that gave us, really grew the capacity that we had as far as the offerings for professional learning that we were providing, but then trying to get creative with how we did that for those areas that were in outlying or more rural areas, and how they could, we could either help some of them connect better together or to connect in with us as well, and those other opportunities that were being provided. Even more things emerged from that as well too. And it's something that I know is a particular area of passion for Allie. And so I'm going to let her share with some of those other opportunities that existed.
Yeah, absolutely, Diane. So, we've shared with you throughout the course of this session ways that we have brought together as a team, right? Different data points. So looking at that student achievement and growth data, looking at the observation data. But often in my work with dioceses, with districts, with schools, there's a third data piece that we will look at as well. And that is a needs assessment with staff directly. So I want to kind of preview for you some next steps that you could potentially take as you're engaging in this work with your schools. So that needs assessment could include a wide variety of areas for teachers as well as for leaders to think about what are some of the topics that are of interest and need for them in the professional learning space. What time of day do they most like to learn? What is their preferred format? I think, if you had asked most of us a year and a half ago, our preferred format would probably look much different than what it is now. I don't know if we're more comfortable in virtual spaces or completely burnt out from them at this point, but I think that's a really telling and really important question to ask your teachers and ask your leaders on a professional learning needs assessment. Some of the other things that often come up in that space is thinking about what time of day do you like to learn? Do you want an early morning session? Do you want a late afternoon one? And how do you like to apply your learning between sessions? So too often in the facilitation space, we focus on those synchronous engagements when we're all together, and we overlook what the learning looks like in the gray space between sessions. So being really open with teachers and leaders and saying, hey, do you want to do a peer observation? Do you want to engage in an action planning tool together? Do you want to do some student data analysis or student work analysis? What does that gray space or that application space look like when it's best applied for you? So you then have your student achievement data, your observation data, and your needs assessment data that you can bring together to start thinking about how can you personalize even more the professional learning that you're providing across the diocese or even in your own specific school. So with that, what we start doing is turning to the facilitators and thinking about, some of these facilitators might be amazing with students in the classroom, but working with adults is a little bit different. So we work with them to think through what are the ways that they can reach the adults most effectively in professional learning sessions and make sure that the time they have together is not only spent purposefully, but also in a very intentional and personalized way. So I do lots of work around facilitator trainings to make sure that those teacher leaders or those building leaders that we're putting into those spaces are able to build sustainability and facilitate really, really effective sessions. So that's kind of the next layer of work of where we would like to take things together. But I want to provide an opportunity for you all to ask any questions that you have. If there's any points of clarification that we can make or slides that you want us to go back through and run through one more time, we are more than happy to do so. We have a little bit of time here together at the end. Great. And in the chat box, John has put the post-webinar survey as well as a link to some upcoming NCEA professional learning opportunities. So definitely make sure that you are checking out those as well. So while some of you may be sort of formulating your questions, I would love to hear from you in the chat box. What is one takeaway that you have from engaging in this webinar? What is one piece where you just kind of had an aha moment and you were like, oh, I could approach that a little bit differently, or I might use that data point or that tool in a different way with my teachers or my leaders? If you could share that with us in the chat box, that would be fantastic. Great question. Do you want to take that one, Diane?
Actually, I'm happy to. So we did have one question that asked how long have our schools been using the same observation tool? And then can we discuss how that evolved? So yes, I can. This has been our third year actually to engage with the performance review process that we've been using, the particular observation tool. And this year looked a little different for us just because once again, we were from this perspective, we were all about just trying to remove as many barriers as we could for our principals, because we know for so many of them being back, we were able to be back in school for in-person instruction for a good part of the school year here in Oklahoma City and in the surrounding areas. And so we wanted to make sure that we were giving teachers good feedback, but we also know that this year looked a lot different for all of us. So this has been our third year to work with the tool. And we've each year that we've used it, we've added a little bit more as far as for the responsibility on the part of the principal and what they're offering back to the teachers, because it was a pretty comprehensive process compared to what we've been doing before, which was very much more just a check the box, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, wasn't really giving anything super specific. So the way that tool evolved for us, actually, as we shared, this was actually part 3 of a 3-part series that we offered for NCEA. And so the first webinar in this series actually was presented at NCEA this year and can be found as an on-demand webinar now at this point through the NCEA, through the Cadence platform. And so where we walked through really kind of how this evolved. As we were doing some of this individual work, just in a nutshell, that's when we really started to see that how we were giving feedback to our teachers really wasn't, it just wasn't specific enough, and we weren't really seeing the growth on their end. And as a result, it didn't translate to student growth. And so that's where the work that we were doing with Allie, and what started really is just some initial professional learning opportunities around data analysis, of student performance. That's when we started to look at, what are we using to really help to provide teachers what they need for growth, and wanted to make it not so much about a gotcha moment or that piece, but how do we really supervise them so that we recognize where their strengths are, but then how do we help in those areas where they know they could use some support. We looked at a variety of different frameworks for that, and landed finally on Charlotte Danielson's framework for teacher performance, and then also used that in coordination with the NSBECs, with the national standards and benchmarks for excellent Catholic schools. We wanted to make sure that we were weaving in those aspects into what was a secular framework, and making sure we were staying true to our Catholic identity as Catholic institutions. Hopefully that helps, Laura, to respond to that question.
All right, I am not seeing other questions come through the chat box just yet, so I want to make sure to share our contact information with you before we go. Diane and I are very much committed to continued connections, being thought partners, even willing to just say, hey, can you look this over? Or how did you handle this? Or, what does that look like? We are more than happy to field any and all of those questions as you engage in this work. So please feel free to reach out to us if you got the resources for today and you're like, oh, wait, what does this look like? Or how do I apply this particular piece? We're more than happy to keep the conversation going. We want to thank all of you for showing up today. We know how valuable your time is, and we appreciate you spending just even a part of your day here with us in collaboration as we think about how we can utilize some of these tools to strengthen our Catholic schools across our archdiocese. So thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining us, both that are watching live and those who will be watching the recording. So if you feel like this has been helpful to you, feel free to share this webinar with your friends and colleagues, and we'll be following up soon. So thanks everyone for joining us. Have a blessed rest of your day.
Right, thank you.
Have a great day.
Same to you.